Hi, I'm John Lande, retired law professor at the University of Missouri Law School Center for the Study of Dispute Resolution. This is the third lecture in a series about how lawyers can work successfully with clients and counterpart lawyers to get good results for clients. This lecture is going to be focusing on how lawyers can use litigation interest and risk assessment, or LIRA, techniques in negotiation. So as I mentioned, this is the third of 4 lectures, and they're about how lawyers can work well with clients and counterpart lawyers. Or the first one talked about how lawyers can work well with clients and counterpart lawyers generally. The second one dealt with using LIRA techniques with clients. This lecture is going to be talking about how lawyers can use LIRA techniques in negotiation with counterpart lawyers, with the other side. And finally, the next lecture will talk about how to help clients make decisions in litigation. Lectures are based on experiences in the United States. Variations exist in practices between countries and within countries. Some of the things that I will say are generally applicable in most contexts, and some in some but not others. So you need to be making judgments about when they're applicable or not. You will be getting copies of PowerPoints of these lectures, and they have links with more information. You can recognize the links because the language is in blue and is underlined. So what is negotiation? This may be an obvious question, but having studied it, I found that there are many different definitions, and there's no consensus about what negotiation is. My definition is negotiation is a process of seeking agreement about a course of action. Now, unlike some definitions, my definition doesn't require that there's a dispute. A lot of times there are negotiations where there isn't a dispute. People have different perspectives, but it's not necessarily a dispute. There isn't necessarily an exchange of offers, as people often think about. There isn't what in American law and common law referred to as legal consideration, or a quid pro quo, so that each side needs to be exchanging something of value. That isn't required in my definition of negotiation. And there isn't necessarily a goal of forming a legal contract. It's just basically a process of seeking agreement about a course of action. And instead of using the preceding 4 elements in a definition, you might use them to describe different negotiations. So you might describe negotiations dealing, dispute negotiations, or negotiations that do involve an exchange of offers, or negotiations where the goal is to form a legal contract. So that's the starting point. Now, this is important because lawyers negotiate in every type of practice. That includes civil and criminal cases, in appellate litigation, in transactions, in administrative law, basically dealing with the government, as well as in internal organizational matters. So if you're working within a company, there are negotiations that go on within the company all the time. And in fact, lawyers negotiate all the time. People often think of negotiation only as a process with counterpart lawyer at the final stage of a case. And obviously, negotiation occurs then, but it also occurs throughout cases with clients, with supervisors, with coworkers, with experts, court reporters, private dispute resolution professionals, and with judges. Even with judges, lawyers negotiate with judges. So let me give you some examples of some lawyers' negotiations. Lawyers negotiate with clients about fee arrangements or the scope of the work that the lawyers are undertaking for the clients. They'll negotiate with their counterpart lawyers for extension of deadlines or resolution of disputes about exchange of information. Lawyers negotiate with supervisors about what arguments to include in a brief. They'll negotiate with coworkers about what to order for lunch or where to go to lunch. They'll negotiate with experts about the content of an opinion letter. They'll negotiate with court reporters about scheduling. They'll negotiate with mediators about what materials to provide to the mediators. They'll negotiate with judges about discovery schedules. And here's a link with more examples of negotiation. So the point here is you should be thinking about negotiation as something that you will be doing all the time with many, many different people. It's not just a very short-term process at the end of a case. So you can think about sort of two categories of negotiations. Some people talk about the behind the negotiations, behind the table negotiations with clients about the case strategy, as well as the across the table negotiations with the other side about the resolution of the case. And actually, negotiation with clients is often much harder than expected and can lead to bad decisions, in part because it is so difficult and communication is difficult, as I've described in particularly the first lecture. But in this lecture, I'm going to focus on negotiation with the other side. And there are three basic approaches to negotiation. One is a counteroffer process, and this is where one side starts with a very high position, the other side starts with a very low position, and then there's an exchange of offers and counteroffers, and the goal is to end up with an agreement most favorable. Each side wants an agreement that's most favorable to them. So one side may start off with a demand of $100,000, the other side may offer a counteroffer $10,000 and then goes to 90,000 and 20 and 80, and they finally end up with some number in the middle. So this is a counteroffer process. It's very common in the United States and probably in many other countries as well. Then there is the interest and options approach. And with this approach, lawyers and parties first identify what the parties' interests are. What are their goals that they're trying to achieve in resolving a dispute or a transaction? And then after they identify their interests, they list a range of options that might satisfy the parties' goals. And then they analyze which options best satisfy the parties' interests. And then finally, they pick that option that they think best satisfies the parties' options. So that's the interest and options approach, sometimes called problem solving or interest-based negotiation. The third one is one that you hardly ever see in the literature. I've written about it, and it's described in the LIRA book, and I've called it ordinary legal negotiation, or sometimes norm-based negotiation. And instead of an exchange of offers and counteroffers, or an explicit discussion of parties' interests and options for satisfying the options, the interests, there's a process of focusing on what the normal standards are and making some adjustments from there. The choice of approaches depends on the client's and other side's attitudes. So here are the traditional negotiation models that if you study negotiation theory, you'll see there are the adversarial or positional approach, where parties try to maximize their advantage, starting with the extreme positions. Typically, that's the counteroffer process, or the cooperative or interest-based, where parties try to satisfy all parties by identifying the interests and options for satisfying parties' interests. That's the interest and option approach. And here's this missing model that I talked about. And here, negotiators start with generally accepted norms and argue for advantageous modifications. So let me give you an example of that. For example, in child support negotiations, where parents are divorced or divorcing. In the United States, there are statutes that specify what the amount of child support will be, and you identify the party's income and the number of children, and the statute will give you what the presumed amount of child support would be. So that's the norm, but the parties have the power to negotiate for something other than the statutory presumptive amount of child support. So they, in this ordinary legal negotiation, the lawyers will start with the presumed amount of child support, say it's $500 a month, but the paying spouse or party or parent may say, well, you know what? There are good reasons why 500 is too much and we really should make it 400. And that the party who is receiving the support says, well, you know, there are factors that really mean that I should be getting more than 500, so I should be getting 600. So you're starting with this norm, and then you're making some adjustments from there, and that's the negotiation is based on this norm. And this actually is quite common. And you can see here a link with more negotiation about the negotiation models, and they're described more in the next slide. So the models assume that the key variables are bundled together, but that's often not so. So instead of these models that I've described, I suggest that you focus on the variables about whether parties are concerned about the other side's interests, which they may or may not be. In the counteroffer model, the assumption is that the parties are not concerned about the other side's interests, and if anything, they may want to harm the other side. In the interest and option model, they generally are concerned about the other side's interests because they're looking to find a solution that satisfies both sides' interests. And in the ordinary legal negotiation model, they may have some mild interest in the other side's interest, but again, that's a variable that will vary in particular situations. So that's one variable. Second one is what process they'll use, whether they'll exchange counteroffers or use one of the other processes, whether they will seek to create value or claim value. Creating value is looking to try to find a solution that's going to work well for both parties. It's not a zero sum, it's a positive sum. In claiming value, it's a zero sum assumption where one side's gain is the other side's loss. And so each side is trying to get the most and avoid losing. Another variable, which is implied in these models, but is often what people think about, is whether the negotiators use a hostile or friendly tone, whether the parties use power to get their way, and whether and how they use law or other norms as the basis of the argument. Now, often these are combined. So, for example, in the counteroffer process, the lawyers may not be concerned about the other side's interest. They'll exchange counteroffers. They'll try and claim value. They'll act hostilely. They'll use power, and they'll use the law or other law to try and get their way. But they don't necessarily do all of these things. And indeed, for example, often in a counteroffer process, the lawyers are very friendly and professional, and they won't necessarily use power to get their way. So rather than thinking of models, I suggest that you think about these 6 different variables. So as I mentioned, in a counteroffer process, everyone assumes a zero-sum dynamic. Everyone tries to maximize their partisan outcome. Parties start with extreme positions, expecting that both sides will make a series of concessions. And to justify extreme positions, parties sometimes make dishonest arguments about what they think will happen if they go to court. And for more information about this, see a blog post called BATNAs and the Emotional Pains of Positional Negotiation, which is another term for that. As we've discussed in the first lecture, lawyers and parties often make biased assessments of court outcomes for many reasons. One is that court outcomes often are very hard to predict. They're the cognitive and motivational biases that we discussed in the first lecture. Lawyer-client relationships can lead to a conspiracy of optimism that we've discussed. And the adversary system creates incentive for bias. Each side is trying to get the most they can, and so there's a bias, that there's an incentive to try and portray one's position as favorably as possible and the other side's position as unfavorably as possible. So in this ritual for positional negotiation or the counteroffer process, as I say, both sides start with extreme positions and make counteroffers, hoping to maximize their outcome. The positions are supposedly based on the expected court outcome, but obviously that's not the case. They're using biased and extreme assumptions. And the process may be uncomfortable for everyone, especially for the parties, because it's so unprincipled. So for example, just imagine that you're representing a plaintiff and you're starting with a very high number because you realize that you're going to have to make some concessions along the way, and you're going to have to make some arguments that you don't necessarily believe. And so you'll say, well, we'll take 100,000 at first, and then 90,000, and then 80,000. Well, the reasons that you're making these concessions aren't particularly principled. You're just trying to get the best result that you can. And the clients don't necessarily understand it, even if you explain to the parties, your clients, that this is going to happen, or they may not understand. So it's very difficult, and there's a lot of use of power for each side to try and get the best result that it can. And not only do the parties feel hurt and uncomfortable, but sometimes even the lawyers feel hurt and insulted and angry when they feel the other side isn't being reasonable. So that's the ritual for this positional negotiation or the counteroffer process. For the interest and options process, as I say, it's sometimes called problem-solving negotiation, and the goal is to satisfy the interests of both sides. Parties identify their respective interests. They consider options that might satisfy their interests. They agree on an option that best meets both parties' interests. And at least in the United States, lawyers do not use this process very often. It's used in relatively limited situations, such as what's called collaborative family law, where parties and lawyers agree to use this process, and they use it from the outset. It would be nice if more lawyers and parties used it, but at least in the United States, it's not used as often as I would like. Here's the ordinary legal negotiation process. It's very common, as I mentioned, but rarely discussed, based on shared norms such as typical court outcomes or typical agreement, such as the child support schedules I mentioned, or typical parenting plans or the going rates. And parties may argue for deviations from the norms, like the child support schedule or the parenting plans. It's very common in our parenting disputes where there's a normal pattern where children will live with one parent, typically the mother, for most of the time, but will have visitation or be with the other parent for every other weekend and one night during the week. So that's the normal parenting plan, and there may be negotiations for variations from that, or there may be going rates for civil or criminal matters about typical resolutions. And so parties may argue for deviations from the norms. And it's used typically where there are clear norms, relatively small stakes, and desirable for reasonable, efficient process, rather than the counteroffer, which is not so reasonable and may or may not be efficient. Okay, so I've described what the different processes are. Here are the strategies that you can use in the counteroffer in each of the processes, starting with the counteroffer process. So you want to determine your side's bottom line after trying to improve it. So remember, we talked about in the last lecture how you develop a bottom line. which is your expected court outcome after adjusting the expected future tangible and intangible costs. And you want to try and improve your bottom line by conducting discovery and legal research so that you will get the best possible outcome in court. Then you want to anticipate the other side's strategy. And then you're going to decide on the first offer. So again, if you take the example of the plaintiff who has a bottom line of $50,000, you want to figure out what your first offer will be so that you'll get as much as possible and certainly more than that $50,000. And you will argue to the other side that the court will favor your side. Your client is willing to go to trial, and the other side would incur substantial tangible and intangible costs if they continue to litigate the case. So you're going to make these very partisan arguments to try and get the most favorable results. And then as you proceed in the negotiation, you'll try to anticipate both sides' reactions. And then as the negotiation goes along, you will consider adjusting your bottom line and whether to proceed or settle, proceed in litigation or to settle. And you may adjust the bottom line as you see the other side's reaction and you see your client's reactions. If the other side is being very tough and is not being very accommodating, your client may be willing to accept less than what the bottom line was earlier. Or if they seem to be afraid and willing to be very accommodating, you may increase your bottom line and increase your expectations about what to expect if you're a plaintiff or if you're a defendant, to decrease the amount that you're willing to pay. Now, in an interest in options process, the process, you should start by discussing the most obvious interests. Now, the reason I say that, as opposed to all the interests, is that there's a risk in the interest in options process, which is that if you disclose your client's interests, the other side may take advantage of that by making demands that that your client trade off something for getting this interest that the other side may not be so interested in, concerned about. So you typically want to start with the most obvious interests of the parties. And if the negotiation goes well, you will share increasingly sensitive information and interests. And then you'll discuss options that might address both sides' interests, especially your clients. And then you'll respond to the other side's cooperative or uncooperative moods. This may be the tit for tat strategy that I've talked about, although typically you're going to want to try and be cooperative, though if the other side is being uncooperative, you may decide that that's not in your client's interests. And you would end the negotiation if you can't reach an agreement above your client's bottom line. So that's how you go about the interest and options process. For the ordinary legal negotiation process, you would start by identifying the applicable norms, including circumstances justifying deviations from the general norms. So, for example, in a criminal case, you want to think about what the typical sentence would be, or what the typical plea bargain agreement would be, negotiated agreement would be. So would the defendant normally be sentenced to 3 years in prison under these circumstances? And then think about the deviations from the general norms. Or in the parenting situation, you might think about what the child support amount is, what the normal child support amount is, and why the child support amount might be increased or decreased. And then you want to be sure to learn facts in your cases, Kate, that might justify an adjustment in your client's interest. So if you are representing a parent who's paying child support, you want to think about why you can argue persuasively that the amount of child support should be decreased. And if you're representing a parent who's receiving child support, you want to think about facts that would justify increasing the amount of child support. And you want to make a reasonable offer, reasonable, but one that favors your client, and still keep your client's bottom line in mind as a walkaway point in negotiation if necessary. So what do you do in practice? You want to learn your client's interests and priorities, such as the financial outcome, winning, beating the other, or not losing. And not losing is not the same as winning. Your client may feel that they're not going to get a great result. They may not be determined to win, but they just don't want to get a really bad result. A lot of clients just want to get rid of the dispute and get on with life. And this is an important thing for you to understand, to what extent that's your client's interest and priority. Clients often have a strong interest in being treated with respect. Plaintiffs often want an apology. And there are lots of other things that we've talked about. So my strong advice, as I described in the first lecture, at the outset of a case, try to develop a good relationship with your counterpart lawyer. And you can see a link here to an article that goes into more detail about how to go about doing that. So you should prepare wisely, make your best estimates of the expected court outcome, as we've talked about, identify the key factual and legal uncertainties, investigate the law and the facts to reduce those uncertainties, and recognize that there are a range of possible outcomes if you go to trial. And then you want to make a realistic estimates of future legal fees and the costs of going to trial. And then help your clients identify and value intangible interests. And it's important to emphasize here that with these intangible interests, there is no objective one. Not every client has the same intangible interests. Some may be concerned about being treated with respect or want an apology, and others may not. Some may be concerned about risk and others may not. Or they may have a high tolerance for risk and others may have a low tolerance for risk. So you have to help your client identify what their intangible interests are, and then they have to value them. And every client will have different intangible interests and they will value them differently. And so in the last lecture, I described how you can work with your client to help them identify and value their intangible interests. And this is so important because this will affect what the bottom line will be for them. And as I've described, this bottom line will evolve or may evolve depending on how the negotiation goes. And based on all of this, you will develop a negotiation strategy in coordination with your client. Now, of course, we're in the new normal following the pandemic. And in the United States, and I suspect around the world, people have been using video to do their legal cases and their negotiations and their mediations. And I suspect that people often will continue to use video even after they feel safe meeting in person. And so you should be prepared to use video and think about when it would be in your interest and your client's interest. Professionals and many lay people will be comfortable with it and appreciate the efficiency. Bear in mind that you're going to need to have patience with communication problems, extra time needed, especially to talk with clients, and technology problems. Increasingly, people will be more sophisticated with dealing with and used to dealing with video, but not all of them. Some clients just don't use technology very much, and they're going to need some more help. So you need to think about what the clients are going to need in a given case. And then think about breaking negotiation down into stages. So it may not all be done in a single meeting. It may be done over a period of time, over a series of meetings, and this may be particularly true in mediations of cases. Well, that is the end of this lecture, and I hope you found it valuable.